Do you definitely want to know? She used to say always. It was her favorite word whenever I asked if she needed me to check the doors at night, or to carry her luggage, or to stay on the phone a bit longer when she felt uneasy. Always, she'd whisper into my ear, half smiling, like it was a promise that could never break. Back then, I believed it. I was a soldier by trade and by heart, and trust was a piece of my uniform, an essential thread keeping everything together. But time can tear those threads, can't it? You give everything to a promise, and one day you wake up to find that always has been quietly erased. I'm not here to paint myself a victim. I'm just trying to keep steady, trying to understand how a simple everyday gesture can slant you into a concrete wall of betrayal. I saw them that afternoon, clear as day. I'd gotten off work a bit early from the logistics firm, some fluke with the shipping schedules, and I thought maybe I'd surprise my wife. Bring her coffee, see if she wanted a late lunch, something gentle to break the routine. I found her car parked at this small diner at the edge of town. It's not the typical place she'd visit. She's more of an upscale coffeehouse person. Modern, bright decor, endless Wi-Fi. But here was this out-of-the-way diner with dusty windows and chipped paint on the sign. I pulled up behind her sit-in, saw her silhouette in the window. For a second, I felt a tingle of warmth. Maybe she was meeting an old friend or brainstorming some marketing project. But there was another figure beside her. A man. Taller than me, probably, with broad shoulders. I remember the neon open sign flickering behind them, and the sun shining through dusty glass, creating pale streaks of light across the back of his neck. She reached up and touched his cheek, casually, intimately. Like you do when you're alone with someone you trust. I pressed my palm against the car door, heart racing. My mind was screaming, ask her what's going on. Get in there. But something in me froze. Maybe I was afraid. Maybe I already knew. Instead of barging in, I found myself creeping around the side of the diner, peering through that scratched-up window. It felt wrong, like I was the one trespassing. And then I saw his hand, sure as anything, glide slowly down her shoulder to the small of her back. She moved closer, leaning in as he whispered something. I couldn't hear the words through the glass, but I saw her lips part in a quick, soft laugh. No panic, no guilt on her face, only an easy closeness that cut me deeper than any bullet could. Why am I wrong for wanting more? I can almost hear her voice in my head, the times she'd accuse me of drifting, of being too serious, or stuck in old army habits. But in that moment, she wasn't alone. She was with him, letting him settle his hand on her body. They leaned into each other until their foreheads touched, and then I saw her exhale like she'd been waiting for that breath her entire life. It was delicate, sensual, real, a moment you don't share with just anyone. My vision blurred with anger, heartbreak, confusion. This toxic swirl that made my gut clench. I wanted to bust in there, flip the table, and ask, why? Why the hell would you do this? But I was pinned to the spot by some warped sense of control. My training demanded I gather intel, keep my emotions strapped down tight. So I stood there, silent, invisible. They leaned in, and her hand slid to his chest, then pressed lightly. The way she used to press mine. I swear I could taste metal on my tongue, like the bitter tang of adrenaline. Then I watched him tilt her chin, watched their lips almost touch. She let out a soft gasp, and they kissed, right there in that shadowy corner of the diner, behind the row of empty booths. I backed away, stumbling against a metal trash can behind me. The noise was loud, but they didn't look up. My stomach lurched. I half jogged, half limped to my truck, fumbling with the keys. Inside, I sat for a moment, forehead against the steering wheel, struggling to breathe. That was the instant I understood how easily a life can fracture. Everything was so normal just an hour ago. Paperwork at the office, leftover coffee in my thermos, the radio droning on about traffic. Now I was some anonymous bystander in my own marriage, watching her body lean into another man's arms. My wife. My Becky. The mother of the boy I swore was mine. When I finally got home, I didn't say a word. No accusations, no tears. My father always told me, keep your eyes open, your mouth shut, and your fists relaxed. He'd said that before I shipped out overseas for the first time. It was the only way I knew how to survive. So I sat in the kitchen, sipping water from a chipped glass, waiting for her. Time crawled. The overhead light buzzed. My heart pounded a bruising rhythm in my chest. Eventually, Becky walked in with a grocery bag, wearing the same clothes I saw her in at the diner. Black slacks, a white blouse. She paused, gave me that cautious glance. "You're home early," she said, a forced brightness in her voice. I managed to nod, forcing myself not to tremble. "Yeah. I'd finish up some things here." She placed the bag on the counter. "You, all right? You look tired." Am I supposed to break the silence now? Demand some explanation? My hand tensed around the glass. But I said nothing. The words stuck in my throat. I was stuck in that image, his hand on her back, the slow kiss that left no doubt. Part of me was still wrestling with the notion that it even happened. She studied my face for a moment, then busied herself emptying the groceries. I watched her set a carton of eggs in the fridge with that gentle care she used for everything in our home. And I realized how normal she appeared, how unruffled, like she'd stepped out for a routine errand rather than an illicit rendezvous. The first real conversation we had about it wasn't until days later, but it barely counted as a conversation. It was more a swirl of half-accusations, uncomfortable silences, and her deflections. "You've been distant," she said at one point, as if that justified it. I tried to formulate a question. Why am I wrong? Did I fail you? But the words stumbled out as it choked. "What do you want from me?" She shrugged, tears trembling in her eyes. Then we both turned away. It was a standoff that left me feeling guiltier than I should have. Guilt for not seeing the cracks in our marriage sooner. Guilt that maybe I was the one who drove her to this, even though I couldn't figure out how or why. I went about my routine, waking up early, making coffee, heading to the office. But the tension in the house grew, coiling around us like barbed wire. Our boy, Tyler, was oblivious. He was too busy playing with his Transformer toys, climbing up on my shoulders when we were out in the yard. I loved that kid. I was proud of him, proud of how he overcame his fear of the dark after I showed him how to handle a flashlight, shining it at every corner of his bedroom until the shadows retreated. Watching him laugh made me think, maybe we could get past this. Maybe I could swallow the betrayal, fix things somehow, because he deserved a whole family. Then I caught them again. Different place, the local park near the rec center. Late in the afternoon, after a day of soul-numbing spreadsheets, I went to my truck, and from the driver's seat, saw Becky's car parked across from me. She had told me she was meeting a client, finalizing a marketing plan. Instead, there was that same tall figure, Daniel, I'd later learn. I recognized the set of his shoulders, the way he tilted his head, leaning into her, as if hanging on her every word. They were out by the baseball diamond, half hidden by the bleachers. She was telling him something with an animated wave of her hand. Then he pulled her close, pressed his lips to her neck. She let him. No hesitation. It wasn't a fling you bury under guilt. It was routine, comfortable. It was real. That night, I said nothing again. I wondered if she knew I'd seen them. If maybe she wanted me to see. The next morning, while she was taking Tyler to school, I went to the garage. That old army trunk sat in the corner. I lifted the lid, rummaged through the faded uniforms, the boots, some musty photos from deployments. And there it was, my old army knife. The handle was scratched from years of use, the blade still sharp. I held it in my palm, remembering how many times I'd cleaned it in the field, how it was a piece of me as much as my dog tags. But in that moment, it was a weight in my hand that felt both comforting and terrifying. I stared at the cold metal reflection. My face looked foreign. Then I turned and shoved aside some stacked boxes until I saw the bare concrete wall. Without a thought, I carved words into it, slow, deliberate gouges. 1 act, love. 2 act, lie. 3 act, silence. I did it so I wouldn't forget the progression. Love had been act 1 of our marriage, intense, honest, forging a bond. Then her betrayal. Now my silence, which was devouring me from the inside out. Yet I couldn't scream, couldn't throw things, couldn't blame her in a flurry of profanity. Something in me refused to let go of the discipline I'd learned in the army. Instead, I hammered those words into the wall with the tip of my knife. They stared back at me like a prophecy I never saw coming. Still, I needed proof, solid, concrete proof that everything was as wrong as it felt. Suspicion's a slow poison. I told myself I had to get a DNA test for Tyler. Not to punish her, not to lash out. I just had to know. I wasn't sure how, but I used an online service, found a discreet lab that could process it quickly if I mailed in a sample. I'd stolen a swab from Tyler's used straw. My hands shook the entire time I sealed the package. The guilt hammered at me, echoing, "How could you doubt him? He's your boy." But the memory of that second scene, her letting that man hold her, wouldn't let me rest. The results came via email 2 weeks later. Probability of paternity, 0%. My chest caved in on itself. I don't remember breathing. I was at my office desk, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the phone buzzing with calls I ignored. My vision blurred, and for a split second, I thought I might pass out. I clicked away from the screen, closed my eyes. Numbness. That's what overcame me first. Then, out of nowhere, heartbreak so profound I could hardly swallow. Tyler wasn't mine. The boy I'd carried on my shoulders, who giggled when I'd spin him around the backyard, who called me dad. He wasn't mine by blood. That realization hammered me like an executioner's bullet. I went home, still silent. Becky was in the kitchen, typing away on her laptop. She looked at me, a question in her eyes. I just walked past, sat on the couch, stared at the blank TV screen. Hours later, she tried to ask, "Is something wrong?" The nerve of it, right? But there was fear in her voice, like she sensed a shift in the air. I thought about telling her right then, but the words stayed buried. I didn't trust my voice not to crack or rage. I ended up grabbing my car keys, leaving the house. I drove aimlessly, engine roaring through the night, searching for a place I could breathe. I stopped by a 24-hour gas station, bought a cheap cup of coffee that tasted like scorched plastic. The man behind the counter asked, "Rough night?" I said, "You have no idea." The next morning, I waited until Tyler left for school again before confronting her. We sat at the kitchen table. The light coming through the window was a dull gray, as if the day itself knew what was coming. I opened my laptop, showed her the test results. She pressed a hand over her mouth, eyes darting across the screen. Then she whispered, "Oh God." For a moment, tears shone in her eyes. I forced myself to stay steady. "You want to explain?" She started to talk, but I cut her off with a near growl. "Why am I wrong, Becky? Tell me how this is my fault." "Go on." My fists clenched under the table. She lowered her head, tears rolling silently. "I was scared," she finally said, voice trembling. "It was a mistake. I thought it was just once, or I didn't think it would." "Once?" My stomach twisted. More like a pattern. "You think I'm blind? That I can't see you with him?" She looked up, eyes full of shame, or maybe regret. "I never meant to hurt you. It just happened. I was lonely. And you were away. Always away in your head. Even when you were here, your thoughts were a million miles off." It stabbed me, how she tried to rationalize it. I couldn't hold back a bitter laugh. "So you found comfort in another man's arms. Enough comfort to have his child." There was a beat of silence. She reached for my hand, and I yanked it away. She whispered, "I do love you. I do. You gave me so much, but I needed I couldn't hear any more. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping across the tiles. She flinched as though I'd raised a fist, but I kept my fists at my sides, trembling with suppressed rage. "You need it always, right?" I hissed, voice dropping low. "But you found it with him." She started to cry, and I hated how a sliver of my heart still wanted to comfort her. I realized, with nauseating clarity, that I still loved her. Even then, no matter how I tried, I couldn't extinguish that flicker inside me. A love that felt like a double-edged blade. But my pride, my dignity, they needed some form of justice, or maybe just escape. The next day, I packed what I could in a single duffel bag. Clothes, documents, some old army maps that reminded me of simpler times. Becky followed me around the house, tears streaking her cheeks, trying to talk, trying to figure out if there was a chance. "Don't do this," she'd say. "What about Tyler? He needs you." I zipped up the bag and ignored the sting in my chest at the mention of the boy's name. The heartbreak was there, but it was overshadowed by the sense of a final blow that had to land. I told her in a flat voice, "He's not my son. You made sure of that." She sobbed, pressing her hands to her face, and I felt a pang of guilt so strong I almost buckled. Then she pleaded, "Stay, please. We'll work this out. We'll get counseling. Just stay." I answered with a silence so thick it felt like lead. She tried again. "I messed up, but you're still Tyler's father in every way that counts." I grabbed my keys and said, "In my world, fatherhood's a fact, not a guess. I gave you my trust, Becky. You gave me a lie. Now there's nothing left." She reached for me, her tears damp against my hand. "Please." I paused, because a part of me wanted to collapse into her arms, to forget all of it. But the memory of Daniel's hands on her, the DNA test, the look in her eyes when she tried to defend what she'd done, it all swelled up, choking me. I pulled my hand away. Outside, the sky was a dull, overcast stretch of gray. I tossed my duffel into the truck bed. Before climbing in, I looked at the garage, thought about the words I carved in the concrete. 3-act. Silence. I guess that's all that was left between us now. She stood on the front porch, hugging herself, tears falling. I turned the ignition and drove off without another word. I headed east, no real destination in mind. I just needed to move. Rolling down the windows, I let the cold air numb my face. Each mile of asphalt offered a tiny fraction of distance from the memories. But every so often, a flash would strike me, like a whip crack. Tyler's laughter on my shoulders, Becky's eyes when she first told me she loved me, or that ordinary day at the diner that destroyed my illusions. I'd grip the steering wheel until my knuckles went white, forcing myself to keep calm. At some nameless highway rest stop, I parked. My phone kept buzzing with messages from Becky. Please, apologies, confusion. I shut it off. Outside, the wind whipped dust across the cracked parking lot, and a battered vending machine hummed near the entrance. A few people wandered in and out, travelers heading nowhere fast. A thought crossed my mind. What if I just vanish? What if I leave my entire life behind, start fresh somewhere no one knows my name? The idea felt both terrifying and liberating. I got a motel room that night, a cheap place that smelled like stale cigarettes and old carpet cleaner. I sprawled on the bed, staring at the ceiling's water stains. My heart was heavy, weighed down by heartbreak and guilt. Because the truth was, a voice inside me screamed, "You're running. You're trying to forget your own boy, even if he's not your blood." But how was I supposed to stay and pretend it was all okay? The next morning, I sat in a diner across the street. A different diner, ironically. The taste of coffee was bitter, and I stared into its surface, remembering that moment I first saw Becky and that man, the angle of their heads. The memory stung so deeply I couldn't finish my drink. I tossed a few dollars on the table, left for the truck. Each day blurred into the next. The radio was my only companion, a dull chatter of sports scores and talk shows I barely listened to. Twice, I nearly turned around, the guilt eating at me. But each time, I'd picture Daniel kissing her in that shadowed corner, and my stomach would twist. I'd push the pedal harder, forging onward. At the edge of the state line, I parked under a lone tree by the highway. The sunlight slanted low across the horizon, painting everything in gold. I sat there, listening to the wind ruffle the leaves, my phone still silent, turned off in the glove compartment. My old army maps were on the passenger seat, states scribbled with circle marks from old road trips. My gaze landed on them. I remembered how Becky once traced routes for family vacations on those same maps, eagerly planning how we could show Tyler all the wonders of the Rockies, the canyons, the open plains. "We'll explore everything, always," she'd said, tapping the map with her pen. Always. The word stung again, like a bruise pressed too hard. Time lost meaning as I drove on, sometimes slow, sometimes with a burst of speed that felt reckless. My thoughts swirled, no sense of resolution. The ache in my chest was constant. Late one afternoon, I pulled into a small town with a single main street. There was an old billboard advertising a carnival that must have ended weeks ago. I found a bar with a neon sign flickering overhead, Rusty's or something. The interior was dim. A scattering of older men hunched over their drinks, a country song drifting from a jukebox in the corner. I took a seat, ordered whiskey, sipped until it burned my throat. The bartender asked, passing through. I nodded. "Anywhere special?" He pressed. I shook my head. "Just somewhere." He gave me a knowing look, like maybe he'd seen dozens of men on the run from heartbreak. I was halfway through my second glass when I realized how easy it would be to drown. But I refused. My father fought the bottle. I'd seen what it did to him, how it corroded his insides. I set the whiskey aside, leaving half of it untouched. Then I walked out onto the sidewalk, the last rays of sun glinting off the windows. Part of me thought, this is the moment you lash out. This is where you break something or pick a fight. But there was no fight left. Just a quiet, simmering anger that was directed as much at myself as at Becky. That night in the motel, I had a dream. Becky stood on a cliff's edge, holding Tyler's hand. She looked back at me, her eyes filled with sadness. The wind tore at her hair. "Come with us," she said. But I was stuck, my boots rooted in the ground. Tyler reached out for me, but my arms wouldn't move. The dream ended with them, fading into the horizon. I woke drenched in sweat, panting. I glanced at the table clock. 3:47 a.m. The silence of the room was suffocating, a hush that pressed on my chest. I realized I couldn't just run forever. Something had to give. The next day, I found myself driving with a new sense of direction. Not back home. I couldn't face that, but somewhere that held meaning. Eventually, I ended up near a place I used to camp with army buddies, an abandoned road that wound through a forested region. The sign read, "No through traffic." Perfect. I drove until the asphalt gave way to gravel, then to dirt. The sky loomed overhead, an endless stretch of pale blue. At some point, the engine sputtered, and I realized I was nearly out of gas. I pulled over, got out. The air smelled of pine and distant campfires. I walked a ways, letting my mind wander, each footstep kicking up dust. My phone was still dead in the glove box, but I kept thinking about Becky, about the weight of her betrayal, and the love that refused to die inside me. The memory of Tyler's small arms around my neck haunted me. I had to stop, leaning against a wooden fence post, swallowing the lump in my throat. My thoughts roamed to the words I carved in that garage wall. 1 act, love. 2 act, lie. 3 act, silence. That third act weighed on me now. Silence had been my shield, my punishment, my way to cope. But maybe it was time for a new act, an act of acceptance or departure, or something that broke the stalemate. I crouched down, found a piece of chalk in my duffel. something Tyler used for sidewalk drawings. I remember picking it up by accident while packing. With a trembling hand, I wrote on a cracked pavement, 3-act, silence. My letters were shaky, the chalk squeaking. Once done, I stood back and gazed at it. The phrase looked lonely in the empty road, but it wasn't a final statement of doom. It was me acknowledging that I'd reached the edge of everything that once defined my life. The next steps were mine alone. And you know, in that moment, it hit me. I still love her. Even after all the betrayal, the lies, the child not being mine. The love was there, battered and bloody, but not extinguished. It's a strange kind of heartbreak, wanting to hate someone yet finding your heart insists on caring. I pressed my palm to my face, feeling a single tear slip down. For a man who prided himself on staying composed, that tear was a flood. I trudged back to the truck, rummaged for a spare can of gas in the bed. I had enough to get back to the nearest station, at least. After filling up, I drove slowly, not sure if I was heading anywhere in particular, or just letting the road lead me. Every mile, I pictured Becky's last words. Stay. The memory of Tyler's laughter, of him calling me Dad. The ache in my chest was fierce. But maybe I owed it to that boy to at least say goodbye properly. He'd wonder where I went, and that guilt would never let me sleep. It was late evening when I finally turned the phone on again. Almost immediately, it vibrated with a flood of messages. Some were from Becky, others from an unknown number, probably Daniel. I stared at the phone, not sure if I wanted to read them. Then I opened Becky's texts. They started with pleas and apologies, then progressed to worry. Where are you? Please come home. The last few messages were heartbreakingly simple. I'm sorry. Tyler misses you. He's asking why Dad's gone. My eyes burned. I scrolled further and found one from Daniel, short and direct. We need to talk. This is my fault. Don't punish Becky. Punish Becky. I nearly hurled the phone out the window. My foot slammed on the brake, and I swerved onto the shoulder. My hands shook around the wheel. I could imagine him stepping in, trying to protect her from the consequences of their choice. Maybe he felt guilty. Maybe not. Part of me wanted to call him and unload everything I'd been bottling up. But I swallowed the fury. Another wave of heartbreak swept me. She was with him now. As much as it killed me, that was the reality. I drove on, passing a sign that read "Welcome to the next town. Gas, 2 miles." I filled the tank, ignoring the curious glances of the attendant. Maybe it was my expression. Ragged, haunted, or the military duffel in the bed. He asked, "You passing through?" "Just traveling," I said. He nodded politely and gave me change. As darkness fell, I pulled off to the side of the road again. Parked near a cluster of trees, I stepped out and looked up at the sky, dotted with faint stars. Memories of Becky and me lying on a picnic blanket under a starry sky surfaced. We'd trace constellations, whispering about the future, about having kids and building a life. The memory was so warm, so pure, that it seared my insides now. Finally, I took out a notepad from the glove box. I started scribbling. The words poured out. A letter to Tyler, telling him I loved him, and that none of this was his fault. I told him I'd always be proud of him, even if we didn't share the same blood. My handwriting shook, tears blurring my vision. I wrote that I'd be back one day to check on him, but for now, I needed to find myself again. Needed to strip away the confusion before I could be any kind of father figure. I signed it, "Your Dad, James." The next morning, I found a small post office, stuffed the letter in an envelope, addressed it to our house. On some instinct, I wrote Becky's name too. Let her read it if she wanted. Let her see that my anger was real, but so was my love for the child I once believed was mine. The postal worker gave me a sympathetic nod, maybe noticing my red-rimmed eyes. I hit the highway again. The day stretched on, and with each passing sign, Each stretch of farmland or rolling hills, I felt the tension inside me slowly begin to ease. Not vanish, but lessen enough that I could breathe again. My mind returned to the words in the garage, the act structure I'd carved. If the third act is silence, maybe there's a coda, a final scene that I get to define. A scene not about revenge or betrayal or guilt, but about forging a path forward. I realized I wasn't seeking closure in Becky's arms or an apology from Daniel. The closure had to come from inside me. I needed to forgive myself for not being enough for her. I needed to let go of the future I thought we had. By the time dusk arrived, I was on a deserted stretch of highway. The sun a red glow on the horizon. I pulled over. I remembered something my father had told me once. Real strength is in knowing when to let go. It sounded so easy in theory, so impossible in practice. I walked a few yards into the scrubby grass, picked up a chunk of chalky stone, and wrote again on the pavement. 3-act. Silence. This time, it felt less like despair and more like acceptance. If someone saw it, they might wonder who wrote it, and why. But for me, it was a marker of what began. I turned toward the truck, the sky alive with swirling purple and orange. My chest felt lighter than it had in weeks. The heartbreak was still there, don't get me wrong. The sense of betrayal, the memories, they don't vanish overnight. But I could finally inhale without that suffocating pressure. I had the sense I was stepping into an unknown future. No illusions, no false hopes, just facts. Becky's betrayal, Tyler's paternity, my broken illusions, all facts now. But I could live with facts. Facts don't lie. They just are. I climbed back into the driver's seat. My phone vibrated with a new message. This time, I checked it. Wherever you are, Becky had written, I hope you're safe. Please remember we love you. I stared at the message. It was like a final knife twist, because I knew she might well love me in some way. But she also loved Daniel. She'd chosen him in more than just a fleeting moment. Yet I realized I didn't hate her for it. I hated what she'd done, but the love we'd shared. Call me a fool, but it wasn't dead. That love was just overshadowed by betrayal. I typed back a single line. Take care of Tyler. Then I shut the phone again, letting the message stand as my final word for now. Maybe one day I'd want to talk more. But not today. Today, I needed the road, the open sky, and the quiet hum of the engine. In a way, that was my revenge. Removing myself from the equation, leaving her to face her decisions without me. No dramatic confrontation, no shouting or throwing punches at Daniel. Just the cold, calm finality of walking away. Eventually, the moon rose, a pale glow illuminating the 2-lane stretch of asphalt. The night wind whistled through the rolled-down window. I felt the dryness in my mouth, the ache in my shoulders. Despite the heartbreak, there was an odd sense of relief in my bones, like shedding a heavy pack after a long march. I whispered to the darkness, I loved you, Becky. I still do. Always. The word came out like a broken vow, echoing off the empty road. Hours later, I found myself near an abandoned rest stop. I parked, killed the engine. Without the rumble of the truck, the world was eerily still. I stepped outside, listening to the crickets, the distant rustle of wind in the trees. My mind flashed to that day in the diner, when I first saw their hands on each other. It was so raw, so painful. But I let the memory roll through me, not fighting it. That's how you handle an ambush. Stay alert, let the shock pass, then regain control. I sat on the hood of the truck, knees drawn up, arms resting on them. The stars above reminded me of those nights overseas, lying in the dust, scanning the sky to stay awake on watch. Fear and camaraderie all tangled up in the darkness. Only now, the fear was replaced by sorrow, and the camaraderie was a memory of what Becky and I once were, or maybe still could be, in some other lifetime. The next morning, I wrote one more line on the side of the old rest stop in faint chalk, next to the bathroom entrance. Just a phrase. It's not the end. Because, ironically, that's the best I could do to keep going. Maybe someone else would see it. Maybe not. But I needed to put it down. A private message to the world. I started the truck again, the engine protesting with a low growl. I wasn't sure where the road would take me next, but I knew one thing. I was alive. Hurt, scared, furious, but alive. And in that new awareness, I felt the faintest glimmer of something that could one day become hope. I pressed the gas pedal, left that rest stop behind. And if you ever drive along some deserted stretch of road in the middle of nowhere, you might see a scrawl of chalk on the pavement that reads, 3-act, silence. If you do, just know it doesn't mark a final. It marks a beginning. My beginning. Far from the lies. Far from the illusions, forging a path in the quiet aftermath of it all. I'm not saying I found peace, but I found momentum. And maybe that's enough for now. I still think about her, about Tyler, about what the future might hold if I ever circle back. But for this moment, the only voice I can truly rely on is the one inside, telling me to keep driving, keep breathing, keep living. So I do. And the road unravels before me, silent and endless. That's how it started, and that's how it goes on. This is me, carving out the rest of my story in the only way I know, mile by mile, heartbreak by heartbreak, until I can finally say I understand what always really means.